After attending a funeral of an uncle figure in our community, I wanted to share my thoughts on that generation of elders, those elders who came in the 1950s and 60s. He was one of that generation. They did cross continents for polite half truths. They came for work, for survival, and for a promise that if you contributed to this country would stand by you. They arrived when Britain asked for help. Far from being a superpower, the war had drained this country of its manpower and the previous projection power. The buses weren't running on time, the mills were short of workers, the factories were desperate for hands that didn't tire easily. Manual labor was the need of the day. And so these men and women traveled thousands of miles, leaving behind families, familiar food, warmer weather, and everything they knew. They walked into freezing winters, cramped housing, and a society that didn't always smile back at them. Back home, there were farmers and carpenters and other tradesmen who turned their hands to cloth weaving, carpet weaving, working with steel, the molten metal instead of furnaces, and stuff that they weren't used to. But they put their heads down and worked hard, harder than anyone expected them to. They just got on, doing their best. Then came the 70s. Factories began closing, industry collapsed, and suddenly the same people who had spent years keeping the wheels of this country turning found themselves standing in queues at the job centre, being looked at as if they didn't belong, as if they were asking for something they had not already earned. Let's be blunt here. They were rejected, but they weren't rejected because they weren't skilled. They weren't rejected for lack of trying. They were rejected because their names, their accents, their color, they didn't fit. There's nothing new about racism. Doors for them didn't close quietly, they slammed. I know because my father was one of them who was made redundant from British Steels in Sheffield here, and of course offered retraining, but no job offer at the end of it, as opposed to his white colleagues, of course. So what did these elders do? Did they sit back and live off handouts? The popular narrative today would have you believe, of course, that they just lived off the dole. Wrong. One may ask, how did they deal with the institutional racism of the 70s? Did they give up and accept defeat? No, sir. They did what their generation has always done. Stopped knocking on doors and simply built their own door. When companies refused to hire them, they hired themselves. When workplaces didn't want to see their faces, they opened places where all faces were welcome. Many of my generation can probably remember when Thursday was a market half day and everything closed at 6 every day and nothing opened on Sundays. The world was a very different place back then with little in way of modern day service industry. This is where these so-called outsiders made their mark with creativity. Shops that opened earlier and closed later than everyone else. Takeaways that lit up entire streets. Taxis driven through the night by men who barely slept because they had kids to raise and families to feed and protect. They didn't invade an industry, they filled the gaps that others left open. Looking at it objectively, many of these trades would have collapsed without them. These elders came here to help rebuild Britain. And when Britain hit hard times, they rebuilt their own lives without asking permission, nor becoming a burden on Britain. Some people like to rewrite history now as if these communities became successful by pushing others out. No, they became successful by pushing themselves forward when no one else would. And here's the part people forget. They weren't fighting anybody. They weren't against anybody. They weren't trying to take anything away from anyone. They were simply trying not to fall backwards, trying to keep their children warm, trying to keep dignity alive in a country that sometimes made them feel invisible. They tried not to depend on social security handouts, although Mr. Farage would have you believe otherwise today. And yet, despite all this, they never turned their backs on the country they helped build and the country that helped them. They stayed loyal. They paid taxes. They raised generations who serve this nation in every field now, of academia, medicine, to business, to education, to many public services. So when we talk about that generation, let's tell the truth. They stood between rejection and survival, and they chose survival. They stood between racism and responsibility, and they chose responsibility. They stood between poverty and pride, and they chose pride. And the message today is simple. If our elders could hold this country together with nothing but their grit and their bare hands, then the least we can do is hold this country together with understanding, honesty, and a little human respect for each other and for the people who walked this road before us.